Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome to our series of close readings of Graham Oppy's Naturalism and Religion. Today we keep reading from the 6th chapter, Does Religion Defeat Naturalism? Last week we went through the first part of the chapter, which deals with Michael C. Rea's argument against naturalism, which states that naturalism is not a substantive philosophical thesis, but just a research program. And if Rea's argument was successful, then religion would defeat naturalism, but we've seen that it wasn't the case through Oppy's refutation. And so this week we will look at a second attempt to provide a justification for why religion defeats naturalism, and likewise we're going to see if it is successful. So this argument is a challenge to naturalism from contemporary Thomism. So what is Thomism? Well, it's a philosophical, theological tradition based on the thought of Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century medieval philosopher, theologian, and Dominican friar. So basically, he is the central figure of scholasticism. So that was the dominant method of teaching and inquiry in medieval universities, attempting to reconcile faith and reason, notably Aristotle's philosophy and Christian doctrine and theology. Aquinas was basically the goat of the tradition, and he wrote important works in which he tries to give systematic and rational accounts of Christian doctrine. So the most famous of his work is the Summa Theologiae. It is an unfinished but monumental work. I'm not sure if it's pronounced Theologiae or Theologiae. But anyway, it's very long. It's a very long work. It has over 3,000 pages. But the whole work is organized in short and tightly argued articles that answer a specific question, like each following the scholastic method. It starts with a question, like for example, does God exist? And then objections to the question's thesis. Then you have a counter statement, and then Aquinas' own answers and replies to the objections. The Summa covers God, creation, human nature, ethics, law, Christ, the sacraments, etc. And it is where most people learn about Aquinas' views on natural law, on virtue, on God, etc. Notably his famous 5 proofs of God's existence, which we will see in a minute. Closely related is another famous work by Aquinas, the Summa contra Gentiles, or SCG, which is more apologetic in its aim. It tries to show as far as possible, by reason alone, the rational credibility of Christian claims, especially for an audience not already committed to Christian revelation. So to sum up, Thomism refers to the philosophical and theological system developed by Aquinas within this scholastic framework. And it enjoyed a certain revival in recent years, with contemporary Thomism. So contemporary scholars and philosophers are going back to Aquinas because, as Oppy says, they suppose that Aquinas' work contains proofs that defeat naturalism. In particular, some Thomists suppose that A, Aquinas' work contains proofs of the existence of God, and B, that the powers of God are non-natural causal powers. Although Oppy doesn't mention these contemporary scholars by name, he'll just focus on Aquinas' writings himself. On Aquinas himself, sorry. So we will see if it's true. Does Thomism truly provide proofs for the existence of God? And does it provide proofs that God's powers are non-natural causal powers? So the first section goes through the famous 5 proofs found in the Summa Theologiae. They are often called the 5 ways, and you'll find them in the beginning of the Summa, the first part, the second question, the existence of God, and you will find them in the 3rd article. So the question has 3 articles, each with a related question related to the existence of God. So you have the first question, I think it is whether God's existence is self-evident. The second one is, can it be demonstrated? And finally, whether God exists. So the 5 ways are in this 3rd article, and like I said, they are supposed to be proofs of God's existence, probationem in Latin. However, as Oppy says, these proofs are all controversial. There is almost nothing about these proofs that is uncontroversial, even about how to interpret the text that records the conclusions of these arguments. Like even the conclusions themselves to these 5 proofs, these 5 arguments that normally should conclude that God exists, there are many controversies about how to interpret the text itself. So Oppy gives the following example. So the conclusion of the first way in Latin, here's how it reads, and I'm sorry for my pronunciation, I apologize in advance. I'm gonna try to read it, hopefully with a decent pronunciation. I'm not gonna claim that I can, pronounce it correctly, but here we go. So this is the conclusion of the first way. Ergo necesse est devenire ad aliquod primum movens, quod al nullo movetur et hoc omnes intelligent dium. So hopefully that wasn't terrible of a pronunciation. Now that sentence has many translations, given that the Summa is a foundational text in theology and religious philosophy. So of course there will be many translations, which means that people will also disagree about how to translate this text. And Oppy compares 2 translations. He gives the 2002 translation by Catholic priest and professor John Whipple, and the 2016 translation by philosopher and Thomist Alfred Fredoso, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. So Whipple translates it as, therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. And in Fredoso, you have the following translation: therefore, it is necessary to suppose some first mover, not itself moved, and this all understand to be God. Ergo necesse est is both translated as therefore, that's ergo, it is necessary, necesse est, or if we are going to translate word for word, it would be like therefore necessary it is to suppose or to arrive at. Devenire ad has 2 translations, to arrive at and to suppose. Devenire can mean to arrive or to suppose, and ad, it means at. So here there is no controversy. Both translations just say that it is necessary to reach a certain conclusion, which is, and here's where the controversy starts. Aliquod primum movens, with primum, which means first, and movens means mover, and it is translated in Whipple as a first mover, while in Fredoso it is translated as some first mover. So aliquod can mean both a or some, so it's a quantifier, but depending on how you translate it, the meaning can shift. So Oppy says that if we go with a first mover, like it is necessary to arrive at or suppose a first mover, then it might be read in a way that imputes uniqueness, exactly one. And as a result, the text after the semicolon might be taken to identify the unique first mover with God. But if you go with some first mover, it might be read in a way that does not impute uniqueness, at least one. And as a result, the text after the semicolon might be taken to suggest no more than that all first movers are divine. So, in one case, we assert that there is only one first mover, God, and in the second, we assert that there is at least one first mover, which suggests that there can be more than one, and that whatever is a first mover has the characterization of being divine. Quod nullo movetur doesn't seem to be controversial in terms of interpretation, because it just literally means which is not moved, or which, quod, by no one nullo is moved, movetur. And also the rest of the sentence simply means everyone understands this first mover to be God. But the controversy lies in that aliquod. Is it a or is it some? So going with Whipple's translation, the 5 ways take the following meaning, or the outer shell of the argument. So let's begin with the first way, known as the argument from motion. So it is based on the observation that things move and nothing moves itself, so everything is moved by something else. But then there has to be a mover that started the chain. But since the first mover is a mover, it has to move to be able to set the chain in motion. But if it is the first, then nothing moved it. and giving that first mover must exist, otherwise we fall into an infinite regress of movers. That first mover must be unmoved. It must be an unmoved mover. So it goes like this. Premise 1, some things are moved. Premise 2, whatever is moved by another, i.e. nothing moves itself. Premise 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of movers. And so conclusion, therefore, there is exactly one first mover, and that first mover is God. So from 1, 2, and 3. Then we have the second way, the argument from efficient causes. It is based on, it's like, the following, the previous argument. The difference is that is not based on a chain of movers, but of causes. But it follows the same structure, meaning that there must be a first cause that is itself uncaused. So, first premise, essentially ordered efficient causes are ordered in series. Premise 2, nothing can be its own efficient cause. Premise 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of essentially ordered efficient causes. And conclusion, therefore, there is exactly one uncaused first efficient cause, and that uncaused first cause, efficient cause, is God. Then we have the third way, the argument from possibility and necessity, and it's also known as the argument from contingency. So there are contingent beings, some things could not exist, like the chair, for example, that I'm sitting on is a contingent being. It is not necessary for it to exist, but just possible for it to exist. But if everything were contingent, there could have been a time where nothing existed. But contingent beings exist now, so there must be a being that is necessary in itself, which causes the existence of contingent beings. So, this argument is a bit longer than the others. The first premise is some contingent things exist. Premise 2, for any contingent thing that exists, there was a time at which it did not exist. Premise 3, if everything that exists is contingent, then there was a time at which nothing existed. Premise 4, if there was a time at which nothing existed, then nothing exists now. Conclusion, first conclusion, because there are two conclusions, so this is the first conclusion. Therefore, there are necessary things from 1, 2, 3, and 4. The next premise is any necessary being either depends on something else for its necessity or it does not. Next premise, there cannot be an infinite regress of necessary beings, each of which owns its necessity to another. And so the conclusion, there is exactly one necessary being that does not owe its necessity to other necessary beings, and this necessary being is God. So from 5, 6, and 7. Then we have the fourth way, the argument from gradation or perfection. There are things that are better than others, meaning that they are closer to perfection than others. So there must be a maximum, the cause of all perfections, and that is God. So the argument goes like this. First premise, things are more or less good, more or less true, more or less noble, etc. Premise 2, things are more or less good, more or less true, more or less noble, etc., depending upon how closely they approach something that is maximally good, maximally true, maximally noble, etc. First conclusion from 1 and 2, therefore, there is exactly one thing that is truest, best, noblest, and in being to the maximal degree. Premise 3, also the fourth line, whatever is supreme in a given genus is the cause of all other things that belong to that genus. And conclusion, so 5, therefore there is exactly one cause of being and goodness and truth and nobility, etc., for all other beings, and this cause is God, from 3 and 4. And finally, there's the fifth way, the argument from design. So this one is based on the order and purpose in nature. Non-intelligent beings act towards ends, implying an intelligent designer. So we have already encountered a version of this in our discussion on planting gas argument in the 5th chapter, Can Science Defeat Naturalism? Basically, because natural beings or bodies, they act towards a certain end, they don't act randomly, and this even when they lack knowledge of their end or their purpose, which suggests an intelligent design. So this argument goes like this. Premise 1, natural bodies always or frequently act in the same way in order to attain that which is best. First conclusion from that premise, therefore natural bodies reach their ends by intention rather than by chance. Next conclusion, which comes from this conclusion, therefore natural bodies act for the sake of an end. The second premise, so fourth line, natural bodies lack knowledge, and premise 3, things which lack knowledge do not tend to an end unless they are directed to it by some knowing and intelligent being. And so the conclusion is, therefore, there is exactly one intelligent being by which all natural things are ordered to their end, and this intelligent being is God. So from 3, 4, and 5. So these are the 5 ways or 5 proofs for God's existence in the Whipple's translation. Now, maybe some of them are not really clear, and sure, we can go back to that, but for now, something, is striking in that these arguments, they are plainly invalid. So for an argument to be invalid, it means that its conclusion or conclusions, because an argument can have many intermediate conclusions, so its conclusion doesn't follow from its premises. It's possible that all the steps before getting to the last conclusion of each of the 5 ways are fine. Here we are not rejecting any of the premises or the conclusions before the final one in each way. That is the conclusion that says there is exactly one first mover, one uncaused first efficient cause, one necessary being, one cause of being and goodness and truth and nobility, etc. for all other beings, and one intelligent being that orders the end of all natural things. In other words, there is nothing in each argument that leads to the conclusion that there is only and exactly one such entity. For example, in the first way, to go from there cannot be an infinite regress of movers to the conclusion that there is exactly one first mover is a logical error. Maybe there is really just one mover and not multiple first movers or unmoved movers, but you need to provide further evidence for that than simply stating that there cannot be an infinite regress of movers, for example. So that premise is simply not enough to arrive at that conclusion. So if we go with Whipple's translation, we must face the following choice. Either we impute serial logical errors to Aquinas, or we need to provide an account of what Aquinas is doing in the 5 ways that is consistent with his knowingly presenting arguments that are invalid. So, either we say that Aquinas is making some very serious logical errors, or we say that Aquinas was aware of these errors, he knew that the arguments were invalid, but he gave them anyways because he had some sort of other intention in mind rather than proving God's existence with these arguments. So some have tried to provide evidence for the second point. They said, for example, that Aquinas has stronger versions of his arguments that aren't invalid, but they are not in the Summa Theologiae. The weaker versions were only intended to be something like pointers to or reminders of proofs of the existence of God. So these 5 ways would be then just outlines or reminding notes of full arguments that he presented elsewhere. So proponents of such views, they argue that the complete arguments are fully presented elsewhere in Aquinas' writings, for example in the Summa contra Gentiles, the SCG. So that work is like we said, a systematic defense of Christian doctrine using reason against non-Christians, the Gentiles, such as Muslims, Jews, pagans, and other philosophers. So knowing that his interlocutors don't accept Christian revelation, Aquinas relies heavily in that text on Aristotelian metaphysics, logic, and causal reasoning. So maybe there we have a fuller account of the 5 ways that aren't invalid. You can say that given that the Summa Theologiae was addressed to an audience that already accepts that there is only one God, those arguments should be taken as preaching to the choir, instead of trying to convince someone who's not a Christian or a theist of God's existence and the Christian God, that is. But is it really the case? Well, Oppy will come back to the Summa Contra Gentiles in the next section, but for now, let's just agree that if we go with Whipple's translation, the 5 ways are just plainly invalid, or they are reminders of proofs fully presented elsewhere. Now, what about Fredosso's translation, that we suppose some first mover or efficient uncaused cause, etc.? What do we get? Well, let's go through the 5 ways again, and this time with Fredosso's translation. So the first way, premise 1, some things are moved. Premise 2, whatever is moved by another, i.e. nothing moves itself. Premise 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of movers, and therefore, conclusion, there are unmoved first movers, and these unmoved first movers are divine, from 1, 2, and 3. The second way, premise 1, essentially ordered efficient causes are ordered in series. Premise 2, nothing can be its own efficient cause. And premise 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of essentially ordered efficient causes. And conclusion, therefore, there are uncaused first efficient causes, and these uncaused first efficient causes are divine, from 1, 2, and 3. The third way, premise 1, some contingent things exist. Premise 2, for any contingent thing that exists, there was a time at which it did not exist. Premise 3, if everything that exists is contingent, then there was a time at which nothing existed. Premise 4, if there was a time at which nothing existed, then nothing exists now. First conclusion, therefore, there are necessary things, from 1, 2, and 3, 4. And premise 5, any necessary being either depends on something else for its necessity or it does not. And premise 6, there cannot be an infinite regress of necessary beings, each of which owes its necessity to another. And so, conclusion, therefore, there are necessary beings that do not owe their necessity to other necessary beings, and these necessary beings that do not owe their necessity to other necessary beings are divine, from 5, 6, and 7. Then we move to the fourth way. So first premise, things are more or less good, more or less true, more or less noble, etc. Premise 2, things are more or less good, more or less true, more or less noble, etc., depending upon how closely they approach something that is maximally good, maximally true, maximally noble, etc. First conclusion, therefore, there are things that are truest, best, noblest, and in being to the maximal degree, from 1 and 2. Premise 3, whatever is supreme in a given genus is the cause of all other things that belong to that genus. And conclusion, therefore, there are causes of being and goodness and truth and nobility, etc., for all other beings, and these causes are divine, from 3 and 4. And then we move to the fifth way. So, premise 1, natural bodies always or frequently act in the same way in order to attain that which is best. First conclusion, therefore, natural bodies reach their ends by intention rather than by chance. Conclusion 2, therefore, natural bodies act from the sake of an end. Premise 2, natural bodies lack knowledge. Premise 3, things which lack knowledge do not tend to an end unless they are directed to it by some knowing and intelligent being. And so, conclusion, therefore, there are intelligent beings by which all natural things are ordered to their ends, and these intelligent beings are divine, from 3, 4, and 5. So you can see that there is clearly a difference between Fredosso and Whipple's translations. Here we have an argument that points to the possibility of multiple divine beings instead of just one identified as God. But then we clearly see an immediate difficulty. If, contrary to Whipple's translation, these arguments aren't necessarily invalid, they are, but the charge here is more than they are. The charge here is more that they are incomplete. They do not take us all the way to the existence of God. So, at best, these ways are more arguments that seek to defeat naturalism rather than proving the existence of God. And if you argue for the existence of divine beings, then you just argue for the existence of non-natural entities. But it's still open that these beings are God, or if they are multiple gods, or if God is one among those divine beings, etc. As we said, in the introductory short section, Thomism tries to justify two things. That Aquinas' work contains proofs of the existence of God, and B, that the powers of God are non-natural causal powers. So while we can argue that just proving that there are divine beings is enough to suggest that there are non-natural causal powers, and so naturalism is defeated, but we will put that aside for now. The point of Thomism is not to provide proofs that there are many divine beings, but that God, the one and only, exists and that he has non-natural powers. So the arguments are incomplete, and so we are left with only one option, which is we should wonder whether in the following sections of the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas provides for the completion of the incomplete arguments of the five ways. So if indeed they are just incomplete, then normally we should look in the work in which they are presented to find if at any point Aquinas completed them, right? So we must look in the Summa Theologiae. In other words, either we assume that the completed versions of the ways is in other sections of the Summa Theologiae, that is, if we go with Fredoso, or in the Summa contra Gentiles if we follow Whipple. So let's start with the Summa contra Gentiles by following the same route as with Whipple and suggest that what we are giving in the five ways is only intended to be something like pointers to or reminders of proofs of the existence of God that are fully presented elsewhere in Aquinas' writing, for example in the Summa contra Gentiles. So let's see if indeed there is anything here there in the Summa contra Gentiles, that suggests a fully presented version of the five ways to make them valid, and if indeed we get to an actual valid conclusion that there is only one divine being known as God. And after that, we will explore the possibility of the suggestion from Fredoso that, elsewhere in the Summa Theologiae, the arguments have their completion. So, let's take a look at the Contra Gentiles and see if Aquinas provides any supplementary account to fix the five ways. Well, there are five demonstrations of the existence of God in that work, which are found in chapter 13, titled Arguments in Proof of God's Existence. So four of them are Aristotelian arguments, while the fifth demonstration is based on John of Damascus, or Damascene, in his on the Orthodox faith. So this guy was a 7th century monk from Damascus and one of the doctors of the church, as well as one of the fathers of the Eastern Orthodox Church. We'll come to the demonstration based on what he says in his text on Orthodox faith. So Oppy also mentions a sub-demonstration in chapter 15 titled that God is eternal, and that sub-demonstration is akin to the third way, that of contingency. Oppy dismisses it because it has no significant effect on the outcome of the following discussion, but if you want to know about it, well, here's a brief summary. So whatever has a beginning and an end must have it through movement or change. But given that God is unchangeable, he has neither beginning nor end. Plus, change and movement are measured by time, but God cannot change or move in the way that his movement is caused by something else, or that his movement is akin to him changing. So he is unaffected by time. He has all his being simultaneously, and so he is eternal. He has always existed and will always exist, unchanged as he is. But this again simply argues that the first cause, or the unmoved mover, is eternal. It doesn't say that there has to be just one, so we can skip it, just focus on the five demonstrations in chapter 13. So let's start with the first demonstration. Premise 1. Some things are moved. Premise 2, whatever is moved by another, i.e. nothing moves itself. Premise 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of movers, and therefore, conclusion, there is an unmoved first mover, and this unmoved first mover is God from 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so this is just a restating of the first way. Like, there's nothing new here, so it's not a full presented version of the argument. What about the second demonstration? Well, this one is certainly long. It has 17 steps. But does it provide any proof for the existence of God, or is Aquinas again just rushing things? So let's go through it, the second demonstration, and try to keep up. So, first premise. If the proposition that every mover is moved is true, then this proposition is either true by itself or true by accident. Second premise. If the proposition that every mover is moved is true by accident, then it is possible that no mover is moved. And so conclusion, therefore, if the proposition that every mover is moved is true by accident, then it is possible that there is no motion. Premise 3, it is impossible that there is no motion. So second conclusion, therefore the proposition that every mover is moved is not true by accident. Premise 4, if the proposition that every mover is moved is true by itself, then either the mover is moved by the same species of motion as that by which it moves, or the mover is moved by a different species of motion from that by which it moves. Premise 5, I think we reached this premise 5. Anyway, I'm just gonna say 7 and just tell you just that it is a premise. So 7, premise, if the proposition that every mover is moved is true by itself, then if the mover is moved by the same species of motion as that by which it moves, then it could both have and lack that species of motion. 8, premise, it is impossible for anything to both have and lack the same species of motion. So 9, therefore, if the proposition that every mover is moved is true by itself, the mover is not moved by the same species of motion as that by which it moves. 10, if the proposition that every mover is moved is true by itself, then if the mover is moved by a different species of motion from that by which it moves, then since the genera and species of motion are finite in number, there cannot be an infinite regress. Therefore, if the proposition that every mover is moved is true by itself, then if the mover is moved by a different species of motion from that by which is moved, there's a typo there, then there is a first mover that is not moved by any exterior moving cause. 12, if, so it's a premise, if the proposition that every mover is moved is true by itself, then it is not the case that there is a first mover that is not moved by any exterior moving cause. Therefore, 13, if the proposition that every mover is moved is true by itself, the mover is not moved by a different species of motion from that by which it moves. 14, therefore, the proposition that every mover is moved is not true by itself, from 6, 9, and 13, and 15, therefore, the proposition that every mover is moved is not true, from 1, 5, and 14, and therefore there is a first mover that is not moved by any exterior cause, and therefore, 17, there is an unmoved first mover, and this unmoved first mover is God. From 15, with further steps of the derivation suppressed. So I hope that you followed, all right? So let's just move to the next demonstration. Don't worry, we will come back to this second demonstration. So let's go through the 3 remaining ones because they are quite short. So third demonstration. First premise, essentially ordered efficient causes are ordered in series. Premise 2, nothing can be its own efficient cause. And premise 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of essentially ordered efficient causes, and so therefore there is an uncaused first efficient cause. All right, so this is clearly just a restatement of the second way of an uncaused efficient cause. So nothing here is added to make the argument valid. So moving on to the fourth demonstration. First premise, some false things are more false than other false things. Second premise, things are more or less false insofar as they approach more or less closely to that which is absolutely and supremely true. First conclusion, therefore, there is something that is supremely true, from 1 and 2. 4, what is most true is most fully in being, premise, so this is the third premise. And 5, therefore, so second conclusion, there is something that is supremely being, and this is God. So from 3 and 4. So same here, this is just a parallel to the fourth way, that of perfection. Nothing new is added. So there remains only the fifth demonstration, the one based on Damascene. So premise 1, contrary and discordant things cannot always or for the most part belong to one order, except under governance that enables all and each to tend to a definite end. Premise 2, things with diverse natures do come together under one order, not rarely or by chance, but always or for the most part. And therefore, so conclusion, there is a being by whose providence the world is governed, and this is God, from 1 and 2. So, but this is exactly the design argument again. So here Oppy just restated it. He almost, copy-pasted the argument as it is. So this demonstration is really that short in the original text, just one paragraph long, and that's it. So nothing in the world acts randomly or by chance, so everything must be guided by the providence of something, and therefore the universe is guided by the providence of something, and therefore God exists. So again, this is invalid. You cannot logically get to God exists from the universe is guided by the providence of something. So the only demonstration that can attract our attention is that second long one, which is an expansion of the first way. The first two demonstrations are demonstrations of the same argument, that the argument from motion, to get to the unmoved mover. So even the 17 steps long demonstration fails to argue for the existence of God, actually. What it concludes is that there are movers that cannot move by themselves and movers that cannot be moved by something else. So not every mover moves itself, so they require something else to move them, and not every mover is moved by something else. Some movers move by themselves, the unmoved movers. So these are the conclusions 14 and 15. But from this, to get to 16 and 17, there is only one first mover, unmoved mover, a mover unmoved by exterior causes, and that mover is God, and specifically the Christian God. That's a logical error. So the demonstration is invalid, so it is as invalid as the 5 ways. So we can make 3 points about these demonstrations. First, given that Oppy then says about the next chapter in the SCG, chapter 14, about acquiring knowledge about God by remotion, that Aquinas starts with the assertion that we have shown that there is a first being whom we call God. Then this makes it clear that Aquinas means to endorse these arguments, whatever exactly that endorsement amounts to. So in other words, there is nothing lacking from the 5 ways. Aquinas really endorses these arguments as they are. They are not incomplete, given that the demonstrations in the SCG are meant to be taken as complete, and they are just, restatements of the 5 ways. And small parenthesis, the chapter 14, is about gaining knowledge about God through remotion, means that Aquinas argues that we cannot know God in a positive sense, but in a negative sense, by removing removing the properties that don't belong to God. It's saying that we may not know what God is or is like, but we can know what he isn't or isn't like. Anyways, so our first point is that there is nothing lacking in the 5 ways, and so this leads us to the second point. Since Aquinas endorses these arguments, the conclusions of these arguments are subject to exactly the same question of interpretation that arises in connection with the interpretation of the conclusions in the 5 ways. So this means that we are either going to say that they are invalid, and so claim that these arguments in the SCG are also reminders or pointers, and we have to look for the full version in some other works. And I mean, sure, why not? I mean, let's try it again and again and again with another work by Aquinas in the next section, but I think that, you know, you guessed from this sarcastic tone that it's not going to be satisfying and and it's going to be very implausible. And the third point is this. Third, while it is true that the first demonstration receives more extended discussion in the Summa contra Gentiles than in the Summa Theologia, there being three proofs for each of the second and third premises in the Summa contra Gentiles, but only one proof for each of these premises in the Summa Theologia, the final three demonstrations are actually giving more careful expression in the Summa Theologia. So this point is that when we compare the depth of the five ways and the demonstrations, the last three demonstrations are actually poorer in terms of development than the five ways. The only way that is expanded upon in the SCG is the first one, about the unmoved mover, and it is still not enough to save the argument. So if the SCG is supposed to provide the completed versions of the five ways, then you would expect the demonstrations to be more detailed and complex than, you know, the five ways. On that account, the last three demonstrations would be the pointers to, or the reminders of, the proofs of the existence of God that are fully presented in the Summa Theologia, and not the other way around. So we just conclude that, you know, the five ways are intended to be taken as complete arguments, unless, like we said, we still want to give a shot to the thesis that they are just pointers and reminders, but are fully presented in some other work in the Thomistic corpus. And so this is where we get to Ente and Essentia. So it means on being and essence. So this is a short treatise by Thomas Aquinas, one of his early works. It isn't long, but it is extremely demanding and technical. But we don't need to go through, you know, the whole work to get what is relevant here, meaning whether this work actually provides the full version of the five ways and the demonstrations. So Oppy provides the following passage from the work here, where Aquinas discusses the essences of intelligences, which are beings that we will explain. So Oppy says that in that part of the work, Aquinas constructs a rather different argument for the existence of God. And here's Oppy directly quoting from the text. He says, it's a long quote, but here we go. Whatever belongs to a thing is either caused by the principles of its nature, as the ability to laugh in men, or comes to it from some extrinsic principle, as light in the air from the influence of the sun. But it cannot be that the existence of a thing is caused by the form or quiddity of that thing. I say caused as by an efficient cause, because then something would be its own cause and bring itself into existence, which is impossible. It is therefore necessary that every such thing, the existence of which is other than its nature, have its existence from some other thing. And because everything which exists by virtue of another is led back, as to its first cause, to that which exists by virtue of itself, it is necessary that there be something which is the cause of the existence of all things because of its existence alone. Otherwise, there would be an infinite regress among causes, since everything which is not existence alone has a cause of its existence, and has been said, as has been said. It is clear, therefore, that an intelligence is form and existence, and that it has existence from the first being, which is existence alone. And this is the first cause, which is God. So there are elements of the uncaused cause here, but this argument is more about the nature of that first uncaused cause than about, just stating that there is a first uncaused cause. So let's go through this step by step. So first, Aquinas says that whatever belongs to a thing is caused by one of these two things. Either the principle of the thing's own nature, so either it comes from the thing itself, so an intrinsic principle, or an extrinsic principle, something from the outside is the cause. So everything in existence is subject to both causes. Everything has intrinsic principles that cause its behavior from within. Like, for example, what causes laughter in someone? Well, there is an internal ability to laugh. I can cause myself to laugh. And there are also extrinsic principles. For example, the joke that I heard. However, there are properties that can never be caused by intrinsic principles, like existence. Nothing can cause itself to exist. No intrinsic principle can cause existence. So if something exists, it has to be done by an extrinsic principle. In other words, this is the efficient cause argument. For something to exist, it requires something other than itself to cause its existence. But this risks leading us to an infinite regress of causes unless there is a cause that is itself uncaused. And this uncaused cause is existence alone. And that thing is God. So what does it mean that God is existence alone? Well, first, it is of a different nature from all the other things in existence. And the fundamental difference is that its existence is, first of all, an intrinsic principle. It doesn't rely on something else to exist. But it's not an efficient cause to itself. What Aquinas means is that God's existence is his nature or his essence. That's what God is. He is existence itself. But to say he is existence alone also means that he is a simple substance. According to Aquinas, there are many substances, all of them have essence, but unlike God, they are composite substances, meaning that their essence is made of more than one thing. Familiar particulars, as Aquinas calls them, which are material or physical beings, they are made of form and matter. And there are also immaterial beings that are also composite. These are souls and intelligences, like, for example, angels and abstract mathematical theorems and numbers, which are responsible for the movement of the heavenly spheres. So these are composites of essence, of existence, of esse, and form. They are pure form, if you want. Okay, they are deprived of matter altogether, but they are not uncaused. As Aquinas says, they get their existence, their esse, from God. And so this is what matters here. If we reconstruct the argument in syllogistic form, we have the following argument. Premise 1. Necessarily, whatever belongs to a thing is either caused by the principles of its nature or comes to it from some extrinsic principle. Premise 2. It is impossible that the existence of a thing is caused by the form or quiddity of the thing, i.e., the principle of its nature. First conclusion, therefore, necessarily, for anything in which its existence is other than its own nature, there is some other thing, some extrinsic principle from which it has its existence, from 1 and 2. Premise 3, there are things that have their existence from other things. And premise 4, it is impossible for there to be an infinite regress of things, each of which has its existence from another. And so, conclusion, therefore there is a first being which is existence alone, which is the cause of existence in all other things, and this first being is God, from 3, 4, and 5. So we can also reconfigure it so that it looks more like like one of the arguments from the 5 ways. So premise 1, something have their existence from other things. Premise 2, nothing can have its existence from itself. Premise 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of things, each of which has its existence from another. And first conclusion, therefore, there is a first existent thing that does not have its existence from anything else. So from premise 1, 2, and 3. Premise 4, only what in which its existence is its nature, i.e. only that which is existence alone, can be a first existent thing that does not have its existence from anything else. And so, conclusion, therefore, there is a first being that is existence alone, and this first being is God from 4 to 5. So, what to make of this? Is it enough to provide a full version of the 5 ways? Is this argument, is this the argument that the 5 ways are intended to be pointers to or reminders of? Well, no. I mean, it's highly implausible, as Oppy points, to make the claim that the 5 ways and the demonstrations in the SCG are pointers to or reminders of this particular argument found on being and essence. This is highly implausible because, first of all, this argument isn't deeper than the 5 ways. As a matter of fact, it is as simple as any of the ways. So it would be weird that Aquinas needed 5 arguments to point to or remind us of just this one. I mean, just write this one if this is your ultimate argument for God's existence, given that it is as long as, any of the 5 ways. You certainly don't need anything to point to or remind you of it, that's for sure. I mean, it's pretty simple, it's pretty, it's a very simple argument. So better just give this argument then. As Oppy says, after all, this argument is no harder to state than the arguments that are actually given in the 5 ways texts. And secondly, this argument doesn't do a better job either at providing a valid argument for the existence of God. It is vulnerable to the same questions about the interpretation of the conclusion that are contained in the 5 ways text. So in other words, it's either invalid, since again, how can we conclude that that first being is unique, that there is only one first existent thing that is existence alone, or it's also a pointer or a reminder of another argument. But do we have to keep looking for this fuller presented version in all of Aquinas' works? And if we don't, does it mean that we now must go look for other works that we don't have or we don't know of just to find this hypothetical fuller version? I think we should just accept Oppy's conclusion and admit that we have enough evidence to suggest that there isn't a fully presented version of the 5 ways, because the 5 ways and the demonstrations and this argument are their own fully presented versions. Sure, as he admits, there are works by Aquinas that he hasn't discussed here, but none of them contains a fuller version of the 5 ways. So we can just conclude that the claim that what we are given in the 5 ways is only intended to be something like pointers to or reminders of proofs of the existence of God that are fully presented elsewhere in Aquinas' writing is not particularly attractive. So the 5 ways are indeed complete arguments, and they are intended to be taken as such. And so giving this, as we said, they are just plainly invalid. Alright then, let's now take a look at the second interpretation based on Frodosso's translation. We've seen that Whipple's translation doesn't do, since the arguments are simply invalid, and there's nothing to suggest that they are just pointers to or reminders of another more fully presented argument. But that's just if we take the translation that the conclusions are arguing for the existence of exactly one God. If we take Frodosso's translation, which suggests that in the 5 ways, Aquinas just gave an account that there is at least one divine being, then the 5 ways aren't invalid, but just incomplete. And so we would expect to find the rest of the argument in the following sections of the Summa Theologiae. So Oppy says, on this interpretation, we are to suppose that the text of the 5 ways deliberately leaves the formulation of the arguments incomplete. Moreover, we are to suppose that the materials that are required in order to complete the arguments are to be found in the following sections of the work. So what are we supposed to find? Well, clearly we need something more to get from the claims that first there is at least one unmoved first mover, that there is at least one uncaused first cause, that there is at least one necessary being that does not owe its necessity to anything else, that there is at least one cause of being and goodness and truth and nobility and so forth for all other beings, and that there is at least one intelligent being by which all natural things are ordered to their ends, and that the mentioned things are divine. And from there, we need to get to the conclusion that there is exactly one of each, and they are all, one and the same entity, meaning the Christian God. Otherwise, you would have 5 entities if they are, separate. So we need to do 2 things. First, we must arrive at the conclusion that there is exactly one unmoved first mover, exactly one uncaused first cause, exactly one necessary being that does not owe its necessity to anything else, exactly one cause of being and goodness and truth and nobility and so forth for all other beings, and exactly one intelligent being by which all natural things are ordered to their ends. And secondly, show that whatever falls into one of these classes of beings falls into all of them. Like unmoved first movers are also uncaused first causes. Uncaused first causes are necessary beings that do not owe their necessity to anything else. Necessary beings that do not owe their necessity to anything else are causes of being and goodness and truth and nobility and so forth for all other beings. And causes of being and truth and blah 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 for all other beings are intelligent beings by which all natural things are ordered to their ends. And intelligent beings by which all natural things are ordered to their ends are unmoved first movers. So in short, we have to prove that God is the unity of all of these beings. We need to give an argument for why there can only be one of these beings. Not just, one unmoved mover and one uncaused cause, but that there is one being that is both unmoved and uncaused. So nothing besides God can be uncaused or unmoved cause and mover. Like nothing besides God can be an uncaused or unmoved cause and mover. And there has to be, only one God, of course. So let's see if Aquinas provides us with such argument. Well, in the Summa Theologiae, first section, question 11, is about the unity of God or the uniqueness of God, and it has 4 articles. As well as in other parts of the work, notably question 3 on the simplicity of God, which has 8 articles, and 4 on the perfection of God, which has 3 articles. So let's see the outer shell of these arguments and assess if they indeed complete the 5 ways. Now, taken from these 3 questions in the Summa Theologiae, Oppy is going to sum up 3 arguments of God's uniqueness. Let's start with the first argument for uniqueness. Premise 1, for any hexeity, thisness, it is impossible that 2 distinct individuals have that hexeity. Conclusion from this first premise, therefore for any hexeity, for any nature, suchness, if the hexeity is identical to the nature, then it is impossible for 2 individuals to have that same nature. Then we have a lemma, so God's hexeity is identical to God's nature, and conclusion from 3, so from this first lemma, therefore God cannot be more. There cannot be more than one God. So let's explain a bit of the terminology here. Hexeity means what makes an individual thing this particular thing and not another. It's the uniqueness of an individual thing, like what makes Socrates Socrates. Individuals are not fully explained by their common nature. Socrates isn't exhausted by just belonging to the category humanity. Just like an individual horse isn't exhausted by its hoarseness. Each individual possesses a non-qualitative principle, now that's its hixeity, which makes it, numerically distinct from all others that share its same nature. So hixeity is not an accidental feature like height or color, nor a universal essence. It is that by which something is this particular individual. So Socrates is not individuated merely by matter, by his place, or by other accidents, or even his human form, but by his hixeity, which is his Socrateity, if you want. So we can say that each being has a hixeity, has this thisness, what makes Socrates Socrates, but it also has a nature, a suchness, what makes Socrates a human being, or what makes a horse a horse. So this means that the hixeity can never be shared while a nature can. Like for example, me, Ismail, and Socrates, we both have the same nature, but we have distinct hixieties. However, if my hixieties was identical to my nature, then I would be a completely and radically unique individual. I'd be a unique being, actually. And Aquinas asserts that God's hixeity is identical to his nature, and therefore he has to be unique in nature as well. So like nothing can share his suchness, and so there must be only one God. But the second premise in the argument, the third line, which states that God's hixeity is identical to God's nature, needs clarification, because why, should we assert such a premise? So notice that it's not really a premise, but as we called it, a lemma. Now, a lemma is a generally minor proven proposition, which is used to prove a larger statement. It functions as a stepping stone in an argument, like once proven, it can be used once proved. It can be used as a tool in later proofs. Okay, but that's the point. It has to be proven. So actually, we have three lemmas, two which derive from that first one. So let's see what proves lemma 1. Well, that's from the third question, article 3, is their composition of quiddity, essence, or nature, and subject in God. Meaning, is God's hixeity identical to God's nature or essence? So, lemma 1 from question 3, article 3, premise, in things that are not composed of matter and form, the nature or essence must be identical to the suppositum. Lemma 2, God is not composed of matter and form. Conclusion, therefore, God is identical to God's nature, so God's divinity, God's life, etc. Then that's from 1 and 2. So the suppositum here means that which exists in itself and bears properties, like the underlying individual subject. A man is the suppositum and humanity is the essence, if you want. But normally a suppositum is not the same as essence. Okay, a man is not the same as his humanity. So following this, God and his essence should not be the same. But Aquinas argues that it is only valid if the suppositum is composed of matter and form. A man is composed of matter and form, and that's why he cannot be identical to his nature. But for a being who is not composed of matter and form, he can be identical to his nature. So God, being a simple substance, isn't composed of matter and form, so he is identical to his nature. But this is the second lemma. We now have to prove that indeed God cannot be composed of matter and form, and luckily for us, Aquinas proved that in the second article of the third question, so lemma 2, question 3, article 2. Here's how it goes. So premise 1, matter is that which is in potentiality. Premise 2, God is pure actuality. And conclusion, therefore, God is not composed of matter and form. So his argument is that given that God is what acts on matter, so that matter moves and changes by taking form, if he is also composed of matter and form, then he can be acted upon. But for something to be acted upon means that it has the potential or the capacity to change and take on other forms, right? Matter is always in potentiality, always capable of change, which means always in a state in which it can be acted upon. So here we have the Aristotelian distinction between actuality and potentiality. Actuality is when a potential is realized. When I, take some wood as just, brute matter, that wood is potential for chairs, tables, and other things. Once I turn it into a chair, for example, once I bring out a chair out of the wood, once I give the wood the form of a chair, I have actualized that chair. So this means that for a matter to change and take form, for matter to move from potentiality to actuality, there has to be an actualizer, since it is by acting upon matter that the change occurs. But since God cannot be acted upon, and he is an actualizer, then he has to be a pure actualizer. But given that he cannot be acted upon, then he has no potential, and therefore he has neither form nor matter. Or more precisely, he is composed of neither form nor matter. And so with this, we have also answered the third lemma, which Aquinas answers in the first article of the third question, whether God is a body. So God cannot be a body, he cannot be potentiality, he must be all pure actuality. So lemma 3 from question 3 article 1, sorry. So premise 1, what is potentiality is led into actuality only by being that is in actuality in a relevant respect. Premise 2, God is the first being, and so conclusion, therefore, in God there is no potentiality, i.e. God's pure actuality from 1 and 2. So in short, because God is the first being, he has to be pure actuality. He cannot be a body because a body needs first to exist as potential before existing as an act. So, to sum up, this first argument from Hexeity argues that God is unique because his Hexeity is identical to his nature, because he's the only entity who isn't composed of form and matter. Not being composed of form and matter means you act upon, but you cannot be acted upon. So he, God, must be the first being that causes the existence of all the rest, and this argument then settles that God has to be unique, he has to be only one, since he is unique in his nature as well. But this is still limited to 3 ways only out of the 5. This first argument covers the 3 first ways of motion, of efficient cause, and possibility and necessities of contingency. So far, we argue that God must be the uncaused, the unmoved, the necessary mover, and cause of being for all other beings. We also need him to be the cause of goodness, of truth, of nobility, and so forth, for all other beings, and the cause by which all natural things are ordered to their ends. So we need to prove his uniqueness through his perfection and intelligence at designing beings with ends and purposes. So now let's see the second argument for uniqueness, which takes on the perfect aspect. So first you have a lemma, so it starts with a lemma. God has total perfection of being. First premise, but you can also consider the second premise, since a lemma is technically, a premise that had to be proved. So premise, let's say premise 2. If there were 2 gods, they would differ in some respect. Premise 3, if this respect is a privation, then one of the gods is not totally perfect. And premise 4, if this respect is a perfection, then one of the god is not totally perfect. Therefore, it is impossible for there to be more than one God, from 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this argument from the 11th question is pretty straightforward. There cannot exist more than one God, because if there are 2 or more, these gods would be different from one another, and so they would have to be different from their own nature. But the point here is that if these gods are different, then they cannot be totally perfect, because if God 1 is different from God 2, then there is a quality that God 1 has which God 2 lacks, and vice versa. But given that God has total perfection of being, he cannot lack any quality, and therefore it is impossible to have more than one, since you will have to accept that God doesn't have total perfection of being. But this is precisely what needs to be proven. That's the first lemma. Why should we suppose that God has total perfection of being? Well, Article 2 from question 4, is God universally perfect as having in himself the perfection of all things, provides an answer. So here's the lemma. So lemma 1 from question 4, Article 2. God is esse itself. That's lemma 2a and or 2b and or 2c. We will come back to that. So this is a lemma. God is esse itself. Conclusion, therefore, necessarily God has all of the perfections of esse, and 3, possession of the perfections of esse entails possession of all of the perfections of being, and therefore, conclusion, God has total perfection of being from 2 and 3. So esse means existence. So the first line there is God is existence itself. If he is existence itself, then all of existence is in God. So all of being is in God, which also includes the perfections of being. So God has total perfection of being. Now, I think that I have to clarify something here, because when Aquinas says that God is existence itself, he also means that every effect already pre-exists virtually in its efficient cause. This is again, related to potentiality. Potentiality doesn't just exist in matter and form, but also in the efficient cause, meaning in what acts upon matter and form. The chair exists virtually, in the wood, but also in the carpenter. But if God is the ultimate efficient cause, and he is, pure actuality, how can the effects exist in him? Wouldn't that make him potentiality too? Well, no, because here potentiality is different. It's not that God has the potential to become something else, but that a thing has the potential of becoming something else in God. That the potentiality of the chair is in the carpenter doesn't mean that the carpenter has the potential to become a chair, but that the wood has the potential to become the chair in the carpenter. So every effect pre-exists virtually in its efficient cause. But given that effects don't exist in all efficient causes, like the effect of the chair coming into existence pre-exists virtually in the carpenter, but not in a doctor. A human can only be, a human can only be produced by a human after all. So there has to be one efficient cause in which all effects pre-exist. So there has to be one cause as the source of all things that come into existence. So there has to be one cause that is the cause, or let's say that is the source of existence itself. So God is existence itself while all actuality. Also, this is related to perfection, as we said, and we also insisted that having potentiality in an efficient cause is different from having it in a material and formal cause. So to pre-exist in the potentiality of a material cause is to pre-exist in a more imperfect way, since matter as such is imperfect. But to pre-exist virtually in the efficient cause is to pre-exist not in a more imperfect, but in a more perfect way. The chair that virtually pre-exists in the wood is more imperfect than the one that pre-exists in the carpenter, because wood as matter is more imperfect than the agent, the carpenter, who acts upon the wood. So given that God possesses all virtual pre-existing effects, and he is the ultimate efficient cause, then all effects exist in God more perfectly than in the matter. Given that beings are all effects that were actualized in matter, their perfect mode of existence is when they pre-exist in God. So God has the perfection of all beings. But the phrase that God is existence itself also means that God's existence and God's essence are identical. And this is what we need to prove, also as it is, a second lemma. And it has 3 different forms. all from the fourth article and the third question, is God composed of existence and essence? So let's start with the first formulation of the lemma. So lemma 2a, question 3, article 4. So first premise, necessarily whatever there is in a thing beyond its essence cannot be caused either by the principle of its essence or by some cause outside itself. Therefore, so conclusion from this first premise, necessarily if a thing's essay is distinct from its essence, then the essay of the thing is caused either by the principles of its essence or by something outside itself. Premise 2, nothing is sufficient to be a cause of its own essay if it has essay that is caused. And therefore it is impossible, so conclusion, for the essay to be caused solely by the principles of the essence of a thing. And then we have another conclusion. Necessarily, if a thing's essay is distinct from its essence, that's a typo there, its essence, then the essay of the thing is caused by something outside itself, from 2 and 4. God is the first efficient cause, so that's the second way, and so we conclude that therefore God's essay is not caused by another, and therefore God's essay is not distinct from God's essence, from 5 and 7. So let's unpack this. If something is beyond a thing's essence, that something cannot exist because it cannot be caused by the thing's essence or by something outside the thing and its essence. Sure, the wood cannot make itself into a chair, meaning that becoming a chair isn't caused by the principles of its essence, but by some cause outside itself, which is the carpenter. But becoming a chair isn't beyond its essence either, since it can become a chair. Put another way, the chair cannot bring itself into existence because its essence cannot cause its existence. Its existence must then come from an outside cause because its essence alone cannot actualize its existence. So this means that in the case of the chair, essay, existence, and essence are distinct. And when essay and essence are distinct, then there has to be something outside that thing to bring out the existence of that thing. But to avoid an infinite regress, there has to be a starting point. There has to be a thing that is not caused by something else and whose existence is caused by the principles of its own essence, so a thing in which existence and essence aren't distinct. God. Therefore, God's existence and essay are the same thing. So God is essay itself. Moving on now to the second formulation of lemma 2, lemma 2b, question 3, article 4. Premise 1, essay is the actuality of any form or nature. Therefore, a thing's essay is related to an essence that is distinct from it in the way that actuality is related to potentiality. So this is from the first premise. Premise 2, there is no potentiality in God, see lemma 3, question 3, article 1, and therefore God's essay is not distinct from God's essence, from 2 and 3. So, how do we prove that God's existence isn't distinct from his essence? Well, by reminding of the third lemma, since God has no potentiality and is pure actuality, his existence cannot be distinct from his essence. So only beings who are potentiality and require something to act upon them, to actualize them, to bring them into existence, into essay, cannot bring themselves into existence from the principles of their own essence. Thus, their existence is distinct from their essence. You can understand it as this. Essence is like the potentiality of an existence, and existence is the actuality of an essence. If there is potentiality, it has to be distinct from the existence, as it requires something else to make the move from the former to the latter. But given that God doesn't make that move since he is already actual, then his essence and existence are the same thing. In short, he isn't a body. And lastly, lemma 2c, question 3, article 4, it says this: Premise 1, that which has esse and is not itself esse is a being through participation. Premise 2, God is God's own essence. See Lemma 1, question 3, article 3. So therefore, if God is not God's own esse, then God is a being through participation rather than through God's essence, from 1 and 2. Next premise, nothing that is a being through participation is a first being. Next premise, God is the first being, the first ens, and therefore God is God's esse as well as God's essence, from 3, 4, and 5. So I think that this should be clear by now. Participation here means participation in an essence, which means that your existence doesn't exhaust your essence, but needs something else to make you act your essence. The bee's purpose, for example, is to produce honey, that is its essence, but it cannot do it perfectly because first it cannot bring itself into being. It needs something else to create it, and eventually it dies or gets exhausted. For example, Aquinas uses the illustration of a hot thing. A hot thing participates in heat, but it isn't heat itself because eventually it gets cold. And therefore, there has to be something else that heats it up in order for it to keep playing its essence. So a bee has existence, but its existence, but it isn't existence itself. And so all that it does is participate in its essence as a bee. But obviously this isn't the case for God. God doesn't participate in his essence, he is his own essence. So he is the suppositum and the nature of the suppositum. So essence and existence are the same thing in God. So God is existence itself. So with this, we wrap the first two arguments about perfection. We now move to the third argument for God's uniqueness and perfection based on design. So third argument for uniqueness. First premise, all things that exist are ordered to one another. Premise 2, one thing can be a cause per se of one thing. Premise 3, many things can only be only a cause per accidents of accidents of one thing. So conclusion, therefore it is better that many things are brought into a single ordering by one thing than by many. That which is first is the most perfect. That which is first is per se, not per accident's principle, and therefore there is just one first being that brings all things into a single ordering. So this argument tries to argue why there has to be only one designer that orders natural beings to their ends. So Aquinas distinguishes causes per se and causes per accidents, or necessary causes and accidental causes. You have accidental causes when an effect has more than one cause. So this doesn't mean that an effect was brought about by the coordination of many causes, like when someone trips is caused by a plot hole, the darkness of an alley, and he wasn't very careful, etc. Instead, we mean that the effect could be caused by one cause, but it could have been another cause that caused it. In that case, the fact that we got effect X from cause Y is accidental, which doesn't mean random, but that we could have also got X from cause Z. The problem is that an effect that has cause per accidents is less perfect than one that has a cause per se, which means that necessary causes are more perfect than accidental ones. So if all things that exist are ordered, that is the effect, if that order could have been done by another cause than God or by another God, then it would be less perfect, meaning that God himself would be less perfect. But that's impossible. So the order of things must have a necessary cause, and therefore only one cause. So there is only one God, and with this we conclude that God must be the uncaused, unmoved, necessary mover, intelligent being, and cause of being and goodness and truth and nobility and so forth for all other beings, and by which all natural things are ordered to their ends. Now, what to make of these arguments? I mean, do they provide a completion to the five ways? So Oppy starts with the second argument for uniqueness about why having more than one God is impossible, because God has total perfection of being. So God has total perfection of being leads to the conclusion it is impossible for there to be more than one God. If we take God has total perfection of being to appeal to lemma 2a through lemma 1, then the second argument for uniqueness takes as a premise the conclusion of the second way. In other words, we have the second way, that of efficient uncaused cause, which ended with there are uncaused first efficient causes, and these uncaused first efficient causes are divine, and this conclusion serves as a premise for the second argument of uniqueness. So we have there are uncaused first causes, but given that God is perfection and an uncaused first cause, then there has to be only one uncaused first cause. But here's the problem. That assertion that God is perfection in lemma 2a has the conclusion that God is the first efficient cause in its premises. Like, let's look at it more carefully, okay? So here's the second way. Okay, so I'm gonna put it right here so it's more, more clearly, so that you can see why what's wrong with the argument. So we have the second way. So the second way says this. So the first premise is that essentially ordered efficient causes are ordered in series. Second premise, nothing can be its own efficient cause. Premise 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of essentially ordered efficient causes. Conclusion, therefore, there are uncaused first efficient causes, and these uncaused first efficient causes are divine. Now, we need to move from 4 to it is impossible for there to be more than one God, which is what the second argument for uniqueness is supposed to do. So, the second argument for uniqueness goes as follows. God has total perfection of being, that's the first lemma. If there were two gods, they would differ in some respect, so premise. Next premise is, if this respect is a privation, then one of the gods is not totally perfect. And next premise, if this respect is a perfection, then one of the gods is not totally perfect. And therefore it is impossible for there to be more than one God from 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, there has to be a link between the conclusion of the second way and the first lemma of the second argument, which is, first of all, also first premise and also lemma 2 and or 2b and or 2c, God is esse itself. Therefore, necessarily, God has all of the perfections of esse. Next premise, possession of the perfections of esse entails possession of all the perfections of being, and therefore God has total perfection of being. But to justify the first claim that God is esse itself, we've seen that Aquinas justifies lemma 2 in 3 ways, and one is the following. Lemma 2a, necessarily whatever there is in a thing beyond its essence cannot be caused either by the principles of its essence or by some cause outside itself. Therefore, necessarily, if a thing's esse is distinct from its essence, then the esse of the thing is caused either by the principles of its essence or by something outside of itself. Next premise, nothing is sufficient to be a cause of its own esse if it has esse that is caused. Therefore, it is impossible for the esse to be caused solely by the principles of the essence of a thing. Necessarily, if a thing's esse is distinct from its essence, then the esse of the thing is caused by something outside itself. God is the first efficient cause, the second way, and therefore God's esse is not caused by another, and therefore God's esse is not distinct from God's essence. Do you see the problem? If we must rewrite the entire argument, the second way, in its complete form, should be like this. So here's the second way completed. Like this is the full form of the second way. So we start with the first premise. Essentially ordered efficient causes are ordered in series. All right, you need to follow here to fully understand what's the problem. Okay, so let's go through it again. So essentially ordered efficient causes are ordered in series. Nothing can be its own efficient cause. There cannot be an infinite regress of essentially ordered efficient causes. Therefore, there are uncaused first efficient causes, and these uncaused first efficient causes are divine. Lemma 2a. Necessarily, whatever there is in a thing beyond its essence cannot be caused either by the principles of its essence or by some cause outside itself. Therefore, necessarily, if a thing's essay is distinct from its essence, then the essay of the thing is caused either by the principles of its essence or by something outside of itself. Nothing is sufficient to be a cause of its own essay if it has essay that is caused. Therefore, it is impossible for the essay to be caused solely by the principles of the essence of a thing. Necessarily, if a thing's essay is distinct from its existence, then the essay of the thing is caused by something outside itself. God is the first efficient cause, and therefore God's essay is not caused by another, and therefore God's essay is not distinct from God's essence. And then we get to lemma 1. God is essay itself. Therefore, necessarily, God has all of the perfections of essay. Possession of all the perfections of essay entails possession of all the perfections of being, and therefore God has total perfection of being. And now we get to the second argument for uniqueness. God has total perfection of being. If there were two gods, they would differ in some respect. If this respect is a privation, then one of the gods is not totally perfection. If this respect is a perfection, then one of the gods is not totally perfect, and therefore it is impossible for there to be more than one God. So, in lemma 2a, Aquinas introduces all of a sudden the same premise that he actually needs to prove, meaning that God is the first efficient cause. If anything, that premise should be a lemma on its own. It's like, there's a discontinuity in the argument. When you follow from the second way through lemma 2a, when you get to the fifth premise in the lemma, all you get is if a thing's existence is distinct from its essence, then the existence of the thing is caused by something outside itself. Then suddenly, there's this sixth premise that is introduced and asserts out of nowhere that God is the first efficient cause, which is the conclusion that the second way is supposed to get at. Like he already affirmed that God, the perfect God he believes in, is that first cause. See, even if we remove that sixth premise and change God in the sixth and seventh line with there are causes whose existence isn't caused by another and therefore whose existence are not distinct from their essence, the argument will either remain incomplete or that sixth presupposed premise will be inserted later. If from this we jump to lemma 1, we have a problem because now we have to assert that for an ancient cause to have its existence and essence as identical, then that cause must have all of the perfections of existence or of being, and from there he tried to argue that given that an uncaused efficient cause is perfect, there has to be only one. But remember that Aquinas' claim rests on the idea that what pre-exists virtually in the efficient cause is more perfect than what pre-exists virtually in the material cause. But this already presupposes the divinity and perfection of God, so that sixth premise will come back again. Aquinas again presupposes what he has to prove. So, to go back to Oppy, If we take the second argument for uniqueness as a completion of the second way, then the whole argument becomes a circular argument. As he says, so it is obvious that we then cannot use the second argument for uniqueness to complete the arguments of the second way. Using the conclusion of an argument as a premise of that argument may secure validity, but only at the cost of utterly vicious circularity. Also, the second argument of uniqueness is also based on the idea that there is only one necessarily being, because everything else requires something else to exist, therefore they are not necessary. But what can make Aquinas assert this? Why can there be a necessary being that owes its necessity to other necessary beings? For Aquinas, that being wouldn't be perfect then, but why does this being have to be perfect in the first place, and perfect in Aquinas' sense? Aquinas simply presupposes again that this being is perfect, and therefore he makes a circular claim again. So not only does this version of the second argument not complete, it doesn't complete the second way, but it also doesn't complete any of the other ways either, since it will every time presuppose the conclusion of any of the other ways in its premises. It will presuppose that the unmoved mover is unique, that the intelligent designer is unique, that the uncaused cause is unique, and the necessary being is unique, etc. Moreover, it is not less obvious that we cannot use this version of the second argument for uniqueness to complete the argument of the other ways. There is, for example, nothing in this argument that helps us to show that there is just one necessary being that does not owe its necessity to other necessary beings. And then concerning lemma 2b and 2c of the second argument, we can give them the same treatment as the first argument for uniqueness. And all of its lemmas, which is, as Oppy says, they rely upon claims like the following: God is pure act, God is esse itself, and God's esse is identical to God's essence. That's another typo. It's not existence, it's essence. So what's wrong with that? Well, they make the ways actually pointless. Remember that the point of the ways is to prove God's existence, right? And that existence is unique to God only, meaning that there is only one. But the five ways we've argued don't go all the way. They stop at best at there are uncaused first causes. However, Aquinas seems to have claims that doesn't need to appeal to the five ways and get to his conclusion about the uniqueness of God. So it becomes weird that we need the five ways in the first place. Why not just give the arguments for uniqueness? Why bother with the five arguments to show that he is the unmoved mover or necessary being if he's all pure act and existence itself and identical to his essence? You know, like take the claim God is pure act, which Aquinas introduces in lemma 2 of the first argument for uniqueness. With simply that claim, Aquinas can derive other claims that are independent of the five ways and reach the conclusion that there can be only one God. If we take the first argument in its entirety, for example, it would be this. So the first premise: what is in potentiality is led into actuality only by a being that is in actuality in a relevant respect. Premise 2: God is the first being. Premise 3: therefore in God there is no potentiality, i.e. God is pure actuality, from 1 and 2. Then you have another premise: matter is that which is in potentiality. Next premise: God is pure actuality, therefore God is not composed of matter and form. Then, in things that are not composed of matter and form, the nature or essence must be identical to the suppositum. Lemma 2: God is not composed of matter and form, and therefore God is identical to God's nature, God's divinity and God's life, etc., from 1 and 2. For any haexiety then, for any thisness, it is impossible that two distinct individuals have that haexiety. Therefore, for any haexiety, for any nature, suchness, if the haexiety is identical to the nature, then it is impossible for two individuals to have that same nature. God's haexiety is identical to God's nature, lemma 1, and therefore there cannot be more than one God, from 3. Setting aside that the second argument, the second premise, sorry, setting aside that the second premise of the third lemma already presupposes the conclusion that it tries to prove, if this argument is supposed to complete the five ways, then it must be predicated on the five ways. Yet it is completely independent of them. You don't need the five ways here. You don't need to arrive at there are unmoved first movers to get to this argument of uniqueness. Plus, with just this argument, given that God is pure actuality and from it you end up with there is only one God, then of course that one God is going to be the uncaused and unmoved necessary first move and mover, etc. So the same also is true for the second argument for uniqueness with lemma 2b and 2c. In other words, these arguments, they don't complete the five ways. They simply make the five ways redundant. He says, Oppy says, if we have derivations of these claims that are independent of the incomplete arguments that are under consideration, then interest in those incomplete arguments lapses. As we saw in our discussion of the Ente et Essentia, there is then no work left to be done by the premises in those incomplete arguments. A completion of any of the incomplete arguments that renders one or more of the premises of the argument redundant simply does not complete it in the right kind of way. So then we have the third argument for uniqueness, which according to Oppy isn't an argument for uniqueness, unlike the other two, but it is actually an existence argument, meaning an argument about not proving that God is unique, but that God exists. And so its conclusion is that there is exactly one thing that brings all things into a single ordering. So it's like the previous point about the first and second argument for uniqueness. It makes the five ways redundant again. If we start with this third argument, then we conclude that there is just one first being that brings all things into a single ordering. And from there, we can conclude right away that there is only one and only first efficient cause and unmoved mover. So we then don't need the five ways or their premises. As Oppy says, in this case too, we are being offered a completion of the incomplete arguments that would simply render the premises in those arguments redundant. For example, from the claim that there is just one first being that brings all things into a single ordering, we can immediately conclude that that being is the one and only first efficient cause and the one and only unmoved mover. If we add the premises of this argument to either the first way or the second way, we no longer need the rest of the premises of those arguments in order to complete them. So in short, the discussion in question 11, the arguments for uniqueness and their lemmas, that discussion doesn't provide any completion to the incomplete arguments in question 3, the five ways. So should we look for that completion in other parts of the Summa Theologia? Well, no. We're not going to examine all of the Summa Theologia in hopes that we will find a completed version of the five ways, especially when we have those independent arguments. Plus, as Oppy asserts, it is pretty clear that there is no other parts of the Summa Theologia that provides what is needed to complete the allegedly incomplete arguments of the Summa Theologia, part 1, question 3. So, we can conclude two things: that the five ways are either logically flawed or incomplete as they stand. If we accept that, then we should go look for what can rectify those flaws in the Summa Theologia, but we've seen that there is nothing in the writings of Aquinas that shows us how to rectify those flaws. So if we accept these two claims, that the five ways are flawed and there is nothing to rectify those flaws in Aquinas, then what can we conclude? Well, one interpretative conclusion would be the suggestion to write of the five ways as something in which Aquinas had no deep investment. Oppy gives the hypothesis that maybe the five ways had other purposes than proving the existence of God. Maybe their purpose was to just direct readers to words and to encourage them to examine the works of others, like Aristotle and Ibn Sina, who developed these kinds of arguments in much greater details and with much greater precision. After all, Aquinas was deeply influenced, like I said, by Aristotle and the Islamic philosophers like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd. So maybe he wanted Christian readers to get interested in those philosophers by linking their philosophy and arguments to Christian doctrine. But of course, this is purely speculative, and it is very implausible with very little textual evidence, and we shouldn't bother with it. It's just better to say that the 5 ways weren't incomplete and just accept that they are just logically flawed and move on. But here, some of you may argue, hold on, we may accept that the 5 ways aren't to be taken seriously, and that it is plausible that Aquinas himself did not rely upon them in this theorizing about God. But our aim with this chapter is to assert whether Thomism defeats naturalism. That the 5 ways are invalid or incomplete is one thing, but if they are valid enough to defeat naturalism, that's another thing. Arguing that there are at least uncaused first efficient causes can be enough to defeat naturalism, right? And the 2 arguments for uniqueness, if we agree that they are independent of the 5 ways and that they are valid, then they argue for the existence of exactly one God. Doesn't that mean that Thomism defeats naturalism? Well, let's look at that. Now, what is crucial about the 5 ways is that they all rely on a very specific claim, which is that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes or movers or necessary beings, at least for the first 3 ways. So, and as for the 4th and 5th way, the 4th relies on a dubious notion of perfection, and the 5th is a design argument, and we've already dealt with design arguments through our critique of Plantinga in the previous chapter. So it's because of the premise that there cannot be an infinite regress that these arguments reach the conclusion that there has to be an uncaused first efficient cause, a first necessary being, and an unmoved mover, at least one in each case. As for the arguments of uniqueness, they too rely on that premise, that there cannot be an infinite regress to justify their claim that there has to be exactly one God, or at least one God. But there are some difficulties here. First, with the 5 ways, or at least the 3 first ways, it isn't enough to say that there are first uncaused efficient causes, unmoved movers, and necessary beings. We also need to justify their status as divine to defeat naturalism. So these entities cannot be natural entities if the 3 ways are the features of naturalism. However, we don't see how they can be from just their premises. So we can turn to the arguments for uniqueness for that, because they argue for the existence of God as a non-natural and unique entity with non-natural causal power, since he is neither form nor matter. So, just saying that there cannot be infinite regress, first of all, isn't enough to defeat naturalism. It is still needed to be. It's still needed to provide evidence that the absence of infinite regress forces us to accept that the first causes have to be non-natural. But are the 2 arguments of uniqueness valid? Do they succeed in making the first causes non-natural? Well, we don't need to look at them individually, but to the beating heart of Thomism, which is the metaphysical framework that is first developed in the Ente et Essentia. So the argument that we spotted in that work, 2 sections back, serves as the metaphysical framework for the 2 arguments of uniqueness, meaning that both the argument of uniqueness from Hexeity and the argument of total perfection of being, they derive from this one. So by looking at the argument in the Ente et Essentia, we should be able to assess whether Thomism actually defeats naturalism. So let's go through that argument again. So here it is. Necessarily, whatever belongs to a thing is either caused by the principles of its nature or comes to it from some extrinsic principle. It is impossible that the existence of a thing is caused by the form or quality of the thing, i.e., by the principles of its nature. Therefore, necessarily, for anything in which its existence is other than its own nature, there is some other thing, some extrinsic principle from which it has its existence. There are things that have their existence from other things. It is impossible for there to be an infinite regress of things, each of which has its existence from another, and therefore there is a first being which is existence alone, which is the cause of existence in all other things, and this first being is God. So that's the argument which states that a thing's existence is either caused by itself or by an external thing. Everything is caused by an external thing, but that means an infinite regress. So there has to be something whose existence is caused by itself, meaning that there has to be a being which is existence alone, but there can only be one being that is existence alone, because to be existence alone means that its existence is its nature, which means that it doesn't share its nature with any other being, so it is unique. So if we reconfigure the argument into one that has many similarities with the 5 ways of the Summa Theologiae, we'll get to something like this version. Some things have their existence from other things. Nothing can have its existence from itself. There cannot be an infinite regress of things, each of which has its existence from another. Therefore, there are things, first existent things that do not have their existence from other things. Only that in which its existence is its nature, i.e. only that which is existence alone, can be a first existent thing that does not have its existence from anything else. Therefore, there can only be one thing that is existence alone, and so therefore there is a first being that is existence alone, and this first being is God. Now, does this argument defeat naturalism? Well, no. First, naturalism, naturalists, they can agree on the 3 first premises. But before examining those premises from a naturalist perspective, Oppy notes that naturalists may countenance, meaning they can accept, any of the following 3 kinds of beings. Contingent beings that have their existence from other things, brutally contingent beings that do not have their existence from other things, and necessary beings that cannot have their existence from other things. So naturalists may accept contingent being and necessary beings, and in contingent beings there are those whose existence is caused by other things, and those whose existence isn't caused by other things. And we will explain this second subcategory in a moment. Now, Oppy says that if naturalists accept contingent beings, then they accept the first premise. Some things have their existence from other things. Even if naturalists accept that there may be contingent beings that don't have their existence from other things, they cannot make the claim that all contingent beings aren't caused by other things. So they too accept that some things have their existence from other things. But while there are no naturalists who claim that there are only contingent beings of the second subcategory, there are some naturalists that just deny that there are contingent beings altogether and opt for the claim that there are only necessary beings. But as Oppy said, we won't be needing to address this minority opinion. So, premise 2, nothing can have its existence from itself, is also accepted by naturalists. If, as Oppy says, it's understood as the claim that nothing is the efficient cause of its own existence. And this is important. Having your existence from yourself doesn't mean that you are your own efficient cause, because, that just puts the effect before the cause. If I am my own efficient cause, if I made me, then I must already exist to bring myself into existence. So if some naturalists believe in contingent beings that do not have their existence from other things, or necessary beings that do not have their existence from other things, it shouldn't be interpreted as they are their own efficient cause. So naturalists who accept beings 2 and 3, they must reject premise 2. They can say that there are beings who have their existence from themselves, but then they cannot mean by this that they are their own efficient cause. And Oppy claims that there are other ways to interpret premise 2, but we won't be dealing with those different interpretations yet. Now, about the third premise, the one concerning infinite regress. Well, naturalists are actually divided on that. Some accept the premise while others reject it. Some naturalists think that there might be an historical infinite regress of things, each of which owes its existence to the next. Some naturalists think that there might be a mereological infinite regress of things, each of which owes its existence to the wholes to which it belongs, even though there is no maximal whole to which all things belong. So Oppy distinguishes these He discusses these positions in more detail in his book, Arguing About Gods, in the section on Aquinas' 5 ways. Well, actually, he only focuses on the first 3 ways, the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, and the necessary being. And you will find it in the 3rd chapter on cosmological arguments in Arguing About Gods. Oppy argues that there is no explicit argument against an infinite regress in any of the ways. Like, Aquinas simply asserts that there cannot be one, but he just takes it for granted without even giving an argument why there cannot be an infinite regress, or even, circles of causes, like a situation in which A causes B and B causes C and C causes A. But Oppy considers, arguments for infinite regress, and that even in our, Big Bang cosmology, like you would expect that if we accept that the universe had a beginning, the Big Bang, then we cannot accept infinite regress, but infinite regress is still plausible even in a temporarily finite universe. Not just that, but Oppy even claims that it is implausible that arguments that deny infinite regress won't be question-begging, meaning that they presuppose their conclusion in their premise. Now, sure, if we accept that there can be an infinite regress, then it would be game over for Thomism. If Thomism relies on the idea that there cannot be an infinite regress to defeat naturalism, then if we accept infinite regress, then naturalism is safe. But that would be too easy, and again, it is still very controversial to know if there is an infinite regress or not. So what is interesting are the naturalists who agree that there is no infinite regress of things, each of which has its existence from another. And so this is the position that Oppy will consider for the rest of the section. So naturalists accept premise 1, 2, and 3. And given this, they must also accept the conclusion that derives from 1, 2, and 3, which is there are first existent things that do not have their existence from other things. So all naturalists here, if you put aside those who believe in some sort of infinite regress, all agree that there are first existent things. But as Oppy says, they disagree about the identity of these first existent things. Now, here these naturalists who deny infinite regress cannot identify those first existent things with the first category of beings, of contingent beings that have their existence from other things. Since we are talking about first existent things, they cannot have their existence from other things. So they are either going to be the second or the third category. They are either brutally contingent beings or necessary beings that do not have their existence from other things. Either way, all naturalists suppose initial things as first existent things that don't have their existence from other things. So as Oppy says, naturalists who suppose that there are necessary things suppose that necessary things are first existent things that do not have their existence from other things. Naturalists who suppose that there are brutally contingent things suppose that brutally contingent things are first existent things that do not have their existence from other things. Naturalists who suppose that there are necessary things might suppose that initial things and or abstract things are first existent things that do not have their existence from other things. Naturalists who suppose that there are brutally contingent things might suppose that initial things are first existent things that do not have their existence from other things. So naturalists, they accept the first part of the Thomist argument, but what about the second part? And so this part relies on 2 premises, the premise 4 and 5. The fourth premise Fourth premise identifies the nature of first existent beings or first existent things. It asserts that a first existent thing has the characteristic that its existence is its nature, meaning that it is existence alone. Only such a thing can be a first existent thing that does not have its existence from anything else. And from there, it asserts that there can only be one thing that is existence alone. So this is where the controversy lies. Naturalists may disagree about what to call first existent things, but they sure don't define them as Thomists do. As Oppy says, very few, if any, naturalists accept that there could be a thing whose nature is its existence, or a thing that is existence, or a thing that is identical to its existence, or a thing that is identical to its attributes, or a thing in which there is no potentiality, and so forth. Indeed, many naturalists, and not a few theists, deny that it even makes sense to claim that there is a thing whose nature is its existence, or a thing that is existence, or a thing that is identical to its existence, or a thing that is identical to its attributes, or a thing in which there is no potentiality, and so forth. Metaphysical disagreements between Aquinas and contemporary naturalists can be very broad and very deep. See, for Thomists, to say that a first existent thing must be existence alone, or that its nature or essence and existence are identical, or that it is identical to its attributes, meaning that there is no distinction between how it is in itself and how it is for itself, how it appears is also how it really is. This relies on an Aristotelian metaphysical framework that contemporary naturalists don't accept. And here Oppy is detailing that framework that Aquinas relies on. Now, I have to stress before going into them that if you don't know much about Aristotle, these claims won't probably make sense to you, but I'll try to explain them as briefly as possible because the episode is, already almost over 2 hours long. So here we go. In the Ente et Essentia, Aquinas follows Aristotle in supposing that the Aristotelian categories exhaust the familiar first-class things that can be subjects or predicates in propositions. The category of similar substances divides into primary substances, particulars, and secondary substances, universals. Familiar substances are informed matter, roughly speaking, composites of form and matter. The essences of familiar substances are that in virtue of which those substances have esse, meaning that which makes a familiar substance the kind of familiar substance that it is. Familiar particular substances have essences but not definitions, but familiar secondary substances are defined by their essences. A genus is a concept that applies to a familiar substance in virtue of its matter. A differentia is a concept that applies to a familiar substance in virtue of its form. A species is a concept that applies to a familiar substance in virtue of its essence or composition. There are 4 kinds of causes or explanations of change in familiar particular substances: material, formal, efficient, and final. And final causes are ubiquitous, though not universal, incomplete explanations of changes in familiar particular substances. Okay, so let's start with A, the first claim. So the Aristotelian categories exhaust the familiar first class things that can be subject or predicates in propositions. So according to Aristotle, everything we ordinarily talk about falls under one of the following categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and passion. So we don't need to get into details about this, just that these categories, they classify being as it appears in language and thought. What can, meaningfully serve as the object, as the subject or predicate of a proposition. For example, Socrates is a man. that is saying something about Socrates' substance, that he is a man. Socrates is, for example, white, that's his quality. Socrates is 5 feet tall, that's the quantity, etc. So Aquinas takes these categories to be sufficient for describing the structure of familiar reality. Then you have the claim B. Divides into primary substances, particulars, and secondary substances, universals. So primary substances are individual things that exist in reality, such as this man or that horse, and secondary substances are universal kinds, the species and the genus, such as man for species or animal for the genus. So primary substances are what ultimately exists, and secondary substances, they exist as universals that can be predicated of many individuals. So Socrates is a primary substance, while man is a secondary substance. Then you have the claim C. Familiar substances are informed matter, roughly speaking, composites of form and matter. So material or familiar substances are composed of matter, what something is made of, and form, that by which it is the kind of thing that it is. Matter on its own is indeterminate, but form actualizes it. A bronze statue, for example, is bronze, that's matter, shaped in a certain way, and that's the form. Likewise, a human being is a bodily matter informed by a human form, which is what we call the soul. Familiar substances are not pure form or pure matter, but they are composites of both. Then you have D, the fourth claim. The essences of familiar substances are that in virtue of which those substances have esse, meaning that which makes a familiar substance the kind of familiar substance that it is. So for Aristotle and Aquinas, the essence of a substance is what makes it the kind of thing that it is, human, horse, tree, and so on. And so this essence is what grounds the substance esse, its act of being, its existence. Though esse and esse are not identical in creatures. In other words, Socrates exists as a human being because he has a human essence. So his being is the being of a man, not of something else. Then you have the fifth claim, E. Familiar particular substances have essences but not definitions, but familiar secondary substances are defined by their essence. So individual things like Socrates, they have essences, but they cannot be strictly defined because definitions are universal and they apply to kinds, to genus and species, not to individuals. If we take Aristotle's famous definition that man is a rational animal, it is a definition expressing the essence of a secondary substance, man. Then if I say Socrates is a man, I am saying that Socrates has that essence, but he himself is not definable. Then 6, F. F. A genus is a concept that applies to a familiar substance in virtue of its matter. A differentia is a concept that applies to a familiar substance in virtue of its form. A species is a concept that applies to a familiar substance in virtue of its essence or composition. So the genus corresponds to what is more indeterminate and material in a thing. If we take that definition of man as a rational animal, animal here is the genus because humans share bodily life-related features with other animals. The differentia corresponds to form like rational because of the distinctive human form. And the species, man or human, applies in virtue of the composite essence of man, which both includes matter and form as a unified composition. And then G, so the seventh claim, there are 4 kinds of causes or explanations of change in familiar particular substances: material, former, efficient, and final. So the material cause is what something is made of, the formal cause is the form that it takes, the efficient cause is what brings about the change, and the final cause is the end or the purpose towards which the change is directed. For example, in making a bronze statue, so the bronze is the material cause, the shape of the statue is its formal cause, the sculpture is the efficient cause, and the aim of producing a statue is the final cause. So everything that exists has these four causes according to Aristotle. And lastly, H, the eighth claim, final causes are ubiquitous, though not universal, incomplete explanations of changes in familiar particular substances. So Aristotle holds that most natural changes are directed towards ends, towards purposes. For example, an acorn tending to become an oak. So final causality is therefore widespread in nature, not just in human action. However, it is not universal in the sense that every single event must have a clearly identifiable final cause at the level of ordinary explanation. So what to make of all of this? Well, as Oppy says, if Thomism relies on Aristotelian metaphysics, on the Aristotelian metaphysical framework, Thomism cannot really convince naturalists, since the vast majority of contemporary naturalists do not accept all of A to F, and more importantly, more or less no contemporary naturalists accept G and H. So this means that naturalists, they may accept parts of this framework, but they reject it as a unified metaphysical system. For example, they may accept talking about substances, but reject Aristotelian categories as an exhaustive ontology, or that familiar substances are composed of form and matter, or the distinction between genus, differentia, and species. So they don't necessarily reject everything in A to F, but few, if any, accept the whole package. But they do reject G and H, which is kind of the heart in Thomism. I mean, take away the four causes and the claim that final causes are ubiquitous, and what is left for it to justify God's existence. However, A to H don't necessarily arrive at non-naturalism, for everything that they imply can still be put within a naturalist framework. It's just that very few, if any, naturalists accept them. But Aquinas goes further in his metaphysical commitments because, like we said, in addition to the formal particular substances, he adds three entities: souls, intelligences, and, well, God. Aristotle too includes souls, but souls for Aristotle are very different from souls in the Christian sense. They are just the form of a living body. It's not a separate ghost-like substance that inhabits the body. Rather, the soul is just what makes a body alive. It's the set of capacities that distinguish living things from non-living ones and enables a living body to perform vital activities. So they are not separate from the body. But in Aquinas, souls are obviously separate from bodies. When we die, our souls leave the body, but the soul, it remains who we are. But they are just disembodied dead people who will be brought back to life when the kingdom of God is established. As for intelligences, these are immaterial agents who drive the motions of the stars and planets and angels. We've already mentioned them. These are immaterial causal entities that have intellect, such as angels, and or are responsible for the movements of the heavenly spheres. And they act as secondary causes under God. So intelligences and souls, they have a common composition. They are composites of esse and form. Their essence is pure form without any admixture of matter, contrary to familiar substances that are composite of form and matter. But they differ from God in that God doesn't have form. God is pure esse. Unlike the souls and intelligences, God is utterly simple and uncompounded. So God isn't a composite. He's just existence. He's just esse. And so this is where the problems arise from Aristotelian metaphysics and logic. Aristotelian logic is called predicate logic, the subject predicate analysis of propositions. If we take again the proposition man is a rational animal, we have a subject, man, and a predicate, is a rational animal. So what's being expressed in that sentence is a composite of matter and form. the subject is matter and the predicate is the form of that matter which distinguishes it from other subjects, or which makes it recognizable as men. So Oppy takes the following example. Aristotle is erudite. So here the subject is Aristotle and the predicate is erudite. As Oppy says, the predicate is erudite is the linguistic shadow of Aristotle's erudition. We cannot separate our reason to believe that there is such a form from our willingness to assent to the proposition expressed by the sentence. So we have a reason to believe that there is such a form, meaning erudition, and we have a willingness to assent to the proposition expressed by the sentence, Aristotle is erudite, meaning that you take the sentence to be true. A sentence is a linguistic item, Aristotle is erudite. A proposition is the content or claim about the reality expressed by that sentence, roughly that Aristotle has the property of being an erudite. So to assent to a proposition means to judge the sentence that expresses it to be true, to endorse it, to accept it as correctly describing how things are. So to assent to the proposition expressed by Aristotle is erudite is to accept that Aristotle really is erudite. So when Oppy says we cannot separate our reason to believe that there is such a form, erudition, from our willingness to accept that the sentence Aristotle is erudite is true, then the predicate is erudite is the shadow of the erudition that Aristotle has. So since the predicate exists, there must be a correspondence, a corresponding abstract entity, a property or form of which the predicate is the shadow. But of course, a form exists only as instantiated in the individual, not as a separate abstract entity, like in Platonism, for example. So it's not like it's not like there is, for example, erudition as an independent form, and likewise the subject in Aristotle is erudite is a linguistic shadow of Aristotle. The predicate in the sentence Aristotle is erudite can only be a linguistic shadow of Aristotle's erudition if there is some particular informed matter that is Aristotle. So here too, Aristotle must exist in order to have the form expressed in the predicate. So Aristotle must exist to have the erudition attributed to him. So here too, the term Aristotle is the shadow of an actual matter that makes Aristotle. And the predicate is the shadow of the form that makes Aristotle specifically. So you can say that Aristotelian logic presupposes that material and formal causes are inseparable in concrete substances. There is no actual matter without a certain form and no instantiated form apart from matter. There's what Aquinas calls non-designated matter as some sort of indeterminate matter, but whether or not such matter actually exists, this isn't relevant, because what is certain is that there cannot be form without matter. So this is where we arrive at a contradiction in Thomism, because Aquinas seems to not just argue that there can be form without matter, he also claims that form is the efficient cause of matter. Though not in the sense of, bringing matter into existence. Rather, that form is what gives matter its distinctive aspect. But in Aristotelian logic, there couldn't be a pure form. There couldn't be pure forms because there cannot be a linguistic expression that expresses the shadow of a form that is disembodied, that is independent of matter. In other words, there are no sentences in which there are expressions that are linguistic shadows of pure forms, as Kenny, so that's Anthony Kenny, a British philosopher and theologian, from his 2002 book Aquinas on Being. He says a pure form would be something that corresponded to a predicate in a sentence that had no subject, but this seems close to an absurdity. So just clarification, Kenny was trying to defend Aquinas' claim by saying that this interpretation is indeed absurd, and so we need to understand Aquinas differently regarding this, his notion of pure forms. But if the quoted passage in Oppy is right, then there cannot be pure forms such as angels, souls, and intelligences. These will have to be predicates, not subjects, which is absurd for those who believe in them. And even if we accept that they are just predicates, they are predicates to no subjects, which is also absurd because there couldn't be a subjectless predicate. And so to speak of God as pure esse, pure existence, is even worse than that. Because not only that means that God can only be a predicate, not a subject, and a predicate without a subject, but it's a predicate that is not even form. We said that souls and intelligences are esse plus form, right? They are existence and form, and that is why they are pure form. They don't have matter. And that's already a big problem. But in the case of an entity that is just existence, it's not existence plus form, it's just existence. Well, things get more complicated now. So let's see what Oppy says with the case of a simple familiar particular, meaning with a familiar substance, one that is composed of matter and form. In such cases, it seems that existence is part of essence. If you remember, an essence is that which makes a thing the kind of thing that it is. It is the suchness of a thing. So existence is part of that. What makes the particular man known as Socrates a man isn't just that Socrates has the same trait as other men, but that he also exists. So existence is an essential feature for familiar particulars. No familiar particular would be the kind of thing that it is if it did not exist. So a particular needs existence to be part of its essence, and we can see this when we make claims about the existence of familiar particulars. Sentences like Barack Obama exists or Bertrand Russell existed are intelligible because when I say Barack Obama exists, I am making a true statement. I am ascending to the proposition Barack Obama exists because in that sentence, Barack Obama refers to a particular whose essence includes existence. As for the sentence Bertrand Russell existed, the proposition is also true because it was once true, though it is no longer, that Bertrand Russell referred to a particular whose essence included existence. However, when we get to the sentence God exists, we are facing a big problem because the proposition, like the sentence expresses, is kind of absurd. Remember that God is pure existence, meaning that he doesn't have an essence that includes existence. He is just existence. But as Oppy says, that proposition means that pure existence exists, that existence as such exists. If God is pure existence, then this proposition entails the claim that pure existence, just as such, exists. But pure existence is not of the right ontological category for it to be true that just as such it exists. So Oppy means that if we accept that sentence, God is pure existence, we are making a category mistake. To say God is pure existence and that he exists is like saying pure existence exists, which makes pure existence something that has existence. To say X exists normally requires that X be a thing, substance or entity of some kind, but existence is not a substance. In standard metaphysical grammar, things and substances exist, but existence is what things have, not something that itself has existence. So Oppy is saying that Aquinas is treating existence as if it were a thing that could itself exist. And that's a category mistake. In short, God exists for Aquinas means that existence exists, but that's mistaking a predicate for a subject. So, to conclude this section, the fourth premise of the argument found in the Ente et Essentia, meaning that only that in which its existence is its nature can be a first existent thing that does not have its existence from anything else, and also the fifth premise that there can only be one thing that is existence alone, are extremely controversial, and that even within the Aristotelian framework on which they are based, since to suppose that there is such a thing is to make a category mistake. So it is therefore still inconclusive that Thomism defeats naturalism, since even Aristotelianism doesn't support Thomism that much. So this doesn't mean that naturalism defeats Thomism, however. It's just that for now, neither defeats the other. all we have is metaphysical disagreements between Thomism and naturalism that are so wide and deep that it is not credible to suppose that there is a relatively compact set of considerations that suffice to resolve their differences. So in short, the debate continues and the dust hasn't settled yet. Of course, Thomism can suppose that this argument that we explored in this section is sound. They may suppose A, that the conclusion of the argument that there is a first being, that is existence alone, is a logical consequence of its premises, and B, that all of the premises of the arguments are true. But those premises are not convincing enough for naturalists, especially the fourth and fifth premises in line 5 and 6 of the argument. So it is obvious that naturalists disagree with Thomism about the truth of at least some of those premises. So to end this argument and this chapter, we conclude that it is not at all plausible that this disagreement about the premises in Aquinas's argument is readily resolved. There is no reason for naturalists to suppose that there are Thomistic arguments that defeat their naturalism. Okay, but before concluding the chapter, there is a disclaimer, and so in it, Oppy just clarifies his purpose with this criticism of Thomism. He's not claiming that his criticism is sufficient to persuade Thomists to change their big pictures. He knows that it is insufficient, but that's not even his purpose at all. Oppy isn't trying to convince you to abandon Thomism if you agree with it. The second part of the chapter wasn't an argument against Thomistic big pictures, but for the claim that there is no knockdown argument against naturalism that has been advanced by proponents of Thomistic big pictures. So it's not an argument against Thomism, but against the claim that Thomism defeats naturalism. That is, I claim that when we look at the writings of Aquinas, we do not find arguments that are required to give naturalists pause. And I also claim that when we examine the Thomistic big picture, it is not plausible to suppose that it yields materials that compel assent to the conclusion that Thomism defeats naturalism. So that's it. So we end now the chapter with the concluding remarks. So this chapter was about the claim that religion defeats naturalism, and Oppy focused on just two attempted demonstrations. That the first one was Michael C. Rea's argument against naturalism from his 2002 book, Word Without Design, where he tried to argue that naturalism isn't a substantial philosophical thesis and is nothing more than a research program. And in this episode, we went through Thomist arguments against naturalism, which rely on the idea that there has to be one and only and non-natural first existent thing that is God, but none of them actually succeed in providing sufficient evidence that naturalism is deficient when compared to theistic big pictures. So naturalism survives Rea's argument, and it is not threatened by Thomism. That being said, some can object to Oppy claiming that he only focused on just two demonstrations, but there are many other attempted demonstrations that religion defeats naturalism. So what about those? If the two that Oppy reviewed in this chapter don't defeat naturalism, maybe there are others that do, right? Well, it's obvious that Oppy isn't going to consider every single attempt, but as we said from the beginning of our series, when you criticize a claim, you have to criticize the best version of the claim, or at least the core heart of the claim. So even if it clearly is and will always remain an open theoretical possibility that there are religious arguments that defeat naturalism, the two arguments criticized in this chapter are probably core arguments. By this I mean, as Oppy says, that all extant attempts to show that religion defeats naturalism go the way of the two cases to which I have given detailed attention. So every attempt will be a version of Rea's argument and Thomism, but to this day we haven't got a stronger version than the ones that Oppy reviewed in this chapter. So as of today, the 19th April 2026, there are still no successful demonstrations that religion defeats naturalism. Okay, so we're gonna stop here. That's it for today. We finished the 6th chapter, that's religion defeat naturalism, and we answered with the negative. Next week we are going to look at a very interesting chapter. Does science defeat religion? Like we finished the defeat arguments that try to go against naturalism. We've seen that science defeat naturalism, and then we saw if religion defeats naturalism. None of them do, and starting from next week we're going to look at the arguments that try to defeat religion. So we're going to start with science. Does science defeat religion? And then the last chapter will be about naturalism. Does naturalism defeat religion? So that's it for today. I hope that you enjoyed